good morning to everyone. It's wonderful to be here. This is always one of my favorite events. It will still be the New York Impact Investing event for me each year. And I think part of what's wonderful about it is the size. It's not overwhelming, but most of all, the people and the chance that we get to really reconnect and to make new connections and to learn, be explicit, share, and just come away, I think, always more inspired and more informed than ever. So it's with that backdrop that I'm incredibly honored and thrilled to be in conversation with Valerie this morning, so that we can have a chance to really hear and learn from someone who's been an important, major force in transforming the way that foundations think about the investment of their assets. And we get to kind of pull back the curtain a little bit today and hear Valerie's story and hear about the work that she's done in the impact investing world. But maybe when we start, I'd like to be kind of on a personal note, because again, one of the real values of this conference is being able to make those personal connections and to learn from each other and see what it is that we share and that binds us together. It's really cool that you are not only a leading impact investor, but a former special ed, special needs educator and a real expert in education. So I'm just wondering, because I know some teachers in my life, and they don't tend to be the same people that are really interested in finance and investing. So I'm just wondering if you could take us a little bit on your journey and how it was that you found your way into making impact investing such an important part of your life. Was that something that came naturally, that you just always had as a side interest? You were educator by day, investor by night, or was this something that you came to gradually? And were there any challenges along the way?
Well, thank you, Debra, for the question, and thank you for having me here. It is so unlikely that I would ever be talking about investing at all. And my parents always told me, if you look back over your life, it makes more sense than it does looking forward, and this is definitely an example of that. But thank you for having me here, and I want to particularly thank Jamila Petticini, who I don't see right now, but there she is. The reason I'm on stage is actually Jamila for the most part. And I will say that the last time I went to an event with Jamila, Agility was up for OCO of the Year award, and we walked into this enormous ballroom full of men. I was like, oh my God, this is like normal for you to be in such the minority this way? And she's like, yeah, pretty much. Which was so different for me because my whole life has been either at the US Department of Education or working for public school systems, where it's generally a different crowd and certainly a different path. Debra really did encourage me to be personal, and I know this is a room full of people who assess risk for a living, so I thought about it too. But have to say, we actually never talked about money growing up, so I did not have some secret nightlife that involved finance and investing. And in fact, I think part of it, having the last name Rockefeller, you kind of can't avoid the topic of money in some ways, but also my parents were always in public service. And if you look back on it, actually, I think my mother was in micro enterprise. She started a quilting business. I grew up in West Virginia, which was where my father was a politician for 50 years. And so we were always in the public sector of things, but my mother was from Chicago, my dad was from New York. She knew people who liked to shop, and she knew quilters in West Virginia who needed a market. So now that I look back on it, I do think my mother was probably my role model in many ways, but including in impact investing probably. And she was a Head Start teacher, and we had the luxury of not having to talk about money. I know it's an arrogant thing to say, to not talk about it is assuming that you have enough, but there was also a fair amount of guilt associated with it, I would say, especially in West Virginia, where it was wonderful to grow up with such a diversity of people in terms of socioeconomic status. We went to public schools and had a pretty quasi-normal upbringing when your father's the governor, I guess. But it was just easier never to talk about it within the family, and also our parents didn't want us to be spoiled. And I think they had the attitude of not making things explicit in some ways. If you talk about it, then that becomes the thing that you're valuing, and when in fact it's just something that we needed to understand. And so again, in retrospect, this feels very natural, that this is what I do now, but really my whole life had been in education, and starting with under-resourced youth, as you did, and as is so much of the work of High Water Women. So I ended up moving to New York for graduate school and teaching and working here. And I was fortunate to be teaching in the classroom next to mine in East Harlem was a woman who was a Rockefeller Brothers Fund Minority Fellow. And I, of course, had heard of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, but I wasn't really associated with the family, so many of whom are in New York and in the family organizations, because we'd just grown up so differently. That was a great way of hearing about the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. And I think the only reason I ever got onto the Rockefeller Brothers Fund board was because of my expertise in education. And because we did have that program, which was great. Another advantage of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund is that, and some of the Rockefeller organizations, that the boards are half family. So there's a fair amount of nepotism involved, which is great. So you have to be qualified, but they are always looking for Rockefellers who share these interests. And so my learning and impact really came through the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. And if I can address one more thing about that, sorry, on the gender thing.
Yeah.
The name, Rockefeller Brothers Fund, seems unlikely. So I'm usually so defensive about this that I say that part first. But it was in fact founded in 1940 by the 5 sons of John D. Rockefeller Jr., because a lot of people were asking them for money, and they started to get together every Sunday afternoon at my grandparents' house, where I spent a lot of time also, and just sort of trying to formalize their philanthropy and coordinate it. And then it did, over the course of many years, become a very professional, strategic, philanthropic organization that wasn't, it's not just the whims of the board members. There was an older sister, Babs. She had 5 younger brothers, so I'm not surprised she was reluctant to join in the beginning. It's not clear whether she wasn't really asked. She was also a huge partier, which was really frowned on in the family, so who knows. But she actually did join the board of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund and served in 1954 and served there for over 20 years. And her daughter, Abby O'Neill, was the first woman to chair, not even the first woman to chair the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. And then I also followed Abby O'Neill onto the Board of Teachers College, which has a financial literacy program also under Joyce Cowan. So all these women leading things. But we have decided not to change the name, but it is a very female organization, especially if you look at the people working on impact. It's a bunch of women.
So that's good. Always good to know the backstory on that. So I actually want to shift to the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, because in addition to your own journey of making your way, and it's interesting so that you got to the foundation really through the work on education that you had been doing and your expertise in that area. But there's been this incredible journey since you've been at the foundation of another kind, which was from regular investing of the endowment to a very not regular way of investing the endowment. And I wondered if you could spend a little bit of time just kind of unpacking that, because I think a lot of people here have maybe aware of and have heard that Rockefeller Brothers Fund took dramatic steps in the impact investing arena. But if we can maybe unpack a little bit, starting with what it was that sparked that change. Where did that come from?
Well, I'll give another long answer here. Is that the Rockefeller family has been involved in the environment for a very, very long time. And in the good old days when there were many fewer Rockefellers and a lot more money, they would just buy big tracts of land and just turn it over to public parks. And the family is still really involved in supporting parks, but the conservation in that sense evolved in a way to work on climate policy, which the Rockefeller Brothers Fund started doing in 1980, actually. And even, I think it was in the 70s, I'm a 5th generation member of the Rockefeller family. There's some 4th generation members who started an environmental impact fund of sorts. And it didn't go well. They put it all in solar, and so that was, but very, very early on, people were trying to align the money and the values. But that had not really been translated into the family organizations and foundations at that point. And that started more with the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. In 2005, we adopted our first proxy voting guidelines. This was, not to keep harping on this, but it was another woman, Eva Goodwin, who is a 4th generation member of the family. And she had been working for a long time on sustainability issues and economic development issues. And so she's had sort of 2 tracks of work. One has been with ExxonMobil, which did evolve from Standard Oil, which was the company that John D. Rockefeller Sr. founded. And when he was doing, I mean, petroleum used to come from whales, so it seemed like this big breakthrough to start getting oil out of the ground. That seemed better at the time. And he was always very global. There are some business practices he used, which none of us would endorse at this point, but he always thought very scientifically about what he was doing. He always had very strong collaborations, and he always worked internationally. And so I think Neva saw early on, we should continue working that way, but these companies need to evolve. Just as our philanthropic work in the environment evolved, the way companies work need to evolve. So Neva was trying hard, along with some of my other family members, to pressure ExxonMobil to switch their business practices, and tried to work very quietly, sort of lobbying for a long time, snuck their way into a meeting or two, and there was just no receptivity, let's just say, at that time. And in fact, denial of climate change externally, even though internally they knew exactly what was going on. So what the family was decided to go public and do shareholder activism. That was just on the family side. But then Neva also brought that work to the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, where she was a trustee. And at that time, we had an investment committee that was managing all of our investments. And we decided, so we were able to vote our proxies at that point. And we are, I'll go out of order, we just did recently revisit, that's the royal we, that means Jamil and some other people did the hard work of doing this, those proxies, because we feel like it's consistent with our grant-making and democratic practice, that it is shareholder activism is actually just good citizenship. And so we are looking at that again. It can be complicated in the way that you are managing your funds, which is what we ran into. When we first started outsourcing our investments in 2007, then we were in commingled funds. So we'd only really been acting on our proxies for a couple years, and then we couldn't do that anymore.
Would you say, so you have the one family member who's sort of sparking this conversation and saying we have to think differently. So was there, to get to the place where you started voting the proxies, and then we'll get to the fuller steps that you took, was there debate? Was there a generational difference? Were there, people saying, no, we need to just leave the investments the way they are?
Yes, there were these debates. I will say it's unlike a lot of other institutions. The board was enthusiastic. It's just that mind shift, Debra. You all have seen this. We're thinking, nope, there's one place you make money and one place you give it away. It is just so hard to move beyond that. So once a few people on the board and our president, Stephen Heinz, was always supportive of this way of thinking, of no, philanthropy is what we do. We have the endowment, 5%. We're going to do that as well as we can, but it's just not nearly enough. Philanthropy is like $400 billion a year or something in the U.S. last I saw. But you need to move so many other assets to really have an impact. So I think once people shifted their mindset to, oh, actually we're undermining our grant making with our investing, I think then it was not hard to get the enthusiasm, but it's always doing it that's hard, right? And so I think for the investment committee had really liked managing the investments, and so it was a pretty big cultural shift in some ways to an outside, to an OCO, was probably harder in some ways than changing the mindset, because that's a massive process undertaking, and it also really changes the role of the investment committee. So we did make that shift, but then we found ourselves in commingled funds, and we had decided in 2010 that we wanted to commit up to 10% of our endowment to impact investing, which was, known a bit at the time, but not like now. And then the OCO we had at the time, looked into it, but didn't have the right staff to do it or couldn't really operate it. So then we ended up switching OCOs, and that was a little bit. It was a gut check because it had been so hard to make the shift in the first place, and then to think to go out again. On the positive side, we'd always known we wanted to do impact. There was a lot more competition that Perella Weinberg faced at that point because we had a much bigger response to our RFP because the field had grown so much at that point.
And you decided not just to do the 10% allocation to impact, right? But you also made a major divestment decision. Can you talk about that?
Yes, that was the surprise we pulled on them. So we hired Perella Weinberg in January 2014, and they knew impact, and we're all for that, and we're going to be thought partners, and we have been. Everything has worked out really well in that partnership. The divestment part of it, we announced in September 2014, and that was really hard too. And I'm not sure we were totally forthcoming in in our interviews about that we were going to do that. But it caught fire in a way that we were not expecting. Again, to us, it felt natural. And again, the challenge was much more in the process than in the underlying beliefs. I mean, it just made sense. And we got out of coal and tar sands first because we were really focusing on tar sands at the time, and those are the dirtiest fossil fuels. And I think we're at 1.6% or something, and at this point we're like at less than 0.1%. And what's left is, in legacy investments that we would have to take a hit if we moved out of it. So we're not willing to do that. In all fossil fuels, we were over 6%, I think we were at 6.1% or something like that. And now we're down to 6.6%, I think we were. And now we're down to 1.6% in all fossil fuels. And I think it's because of the approach that we have decided to take, which is also very laborious. Again, that's sort of the theme, is it takes a long time to manage, to work out the management of things. It takes a long time to figure out what you have. That's a complicated part of divestment, which we definitely underestimated that challenge of how hard it is to unpack what you have. And then it takes a while to find the impact, which I know is, to find the appropriate investments, which agility has helped us do. So I will say it was more time consuming than we expected. It involved a lot of role changes.
Okay.
And which have been incredibly fruitful. Mm-hmm. It's a mindset change.
And it's so interesting to hear you say that the process of shifting from an investment committee to an OCIO, that was itself as monumental.
Right. Well, you have to change the composition of your investment committee to some extent.
I mean, it just really reminds us to take heed of the fact that we're talking about institutions and organizations that have practices and have culture and have people, and that you don't just say, okay, now it's time to do something differently. You have to really think about the implementation. Can you say a little bit more about Divest, and specifically Divest Invest, the movement that you've been part of, and kind of what's your view of how that's going?
Well, it's growing rapidly, which is amazing. I looked coming in on the train this morning. There are 777 organizations now that have signed on, and like 60,000 individuals or something like that. It's over $5 trillion in assets under management that have been redirected. And I think that it was the strength in the movement is that it's always been very diverse. And so it's faith communities, it's educational institutions, it's municipal governments, it's obviously a lot of individuals, it's pension funds. It's so you need to have that diversity of the movement, because again, there's such an urgency around redirecting as much capital as possible. We do other types of impact investments, but most of our programming is focused on sustainable development, so that's really what we have focused on as part of the reason we started with fossil fuel divestment. But it helps that a few celebrities have gotten into the movement. But again, it really is the nuts and bolts of people calling their investment advisors and saying, we really want to do this, and that this is the right thing to do. And then the pressure mounts, and it's just much easier now than it used to be, because there are more managers who are willing to do that. We even had some managers who turned us down originally when we said we wanted a fossil fuel-free fund, and then they came back to us and said, guess what, we found a manager who will we have conviction about, and will do this. So the movement has grown really quickly, and I think that it's because it's welcomed this type of diversity. But there are people in organizations who go about it different ways. So we went with divestment, and also market-like rates of risk and return, and other organizations have approached it differently. It's part of the reason that it hasn't been as fast for us as some people would have liked. We always feel like we're in the right spot if we're getting criticized from both sides. And some who thinks this is just a token gesture, and it's using the name, and it's hypocritical. Mm-hmm. And you say, okay, the good news is it got attention, so if that's a point of leverage for us, great. And if you can just do the reframing and say, no, this is the way the whole world has to make it actually move. It just makes sense. There's the moral part of it, And there's, for us, the mission part of it at the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. And then there's also just sort of the financial considerations of it's not safe to invest in carbon anymore because you know there's a carbon bubble that's going to collapse. And so you are not actually being a responsible investor by doing this. If you just shift it again to where it's logical for financial and moral reasons, then I think you can bring more and more people in. One more thing I'll say about us going slowly is that we are committed to generational neutrality, we call it. Like basically we are a perpetuating foundation. So we just can't we love what we do grant making wise. And so we just can't accept concessionary returns because we want to keep doing our grant making and also because we've committed and we look at this every 10 to 15 years or so, do we want to continue this foundation or could we spend it down? And we've gone through that exercise again recently and no, we really want to give other generations of Rockefellers and the outside experts who comprise half our board to keep giving into the future. Mm-hmm. So we can't make gestures actually. We need to have this meet the dual mandate of really good returns, and we are outperforming our benchmarks. We just got an update yesterday, and also real measurable impact.
So you're finding, and one of the things I was curious about is that the invest part of the divest invest approach, that invest part, that universe of opportunities is out there, and that's growing. And you're finding
Absolutely.
that. Yeah.
Right. And so in our investment committee meetings, we still have, it's chaired by Hugh Lawson of Goldman Sachs, and he's a pretty intense guy. And the question, that Jamila and her peer, Tamara Larson, who, whenever I say I or we, it's really them. Hugh will always ask, are you recommending this to your other clients? Why or why not? And so generally the risk had been, and that there's just a smaller pool of managers in whom they had that confidence, but the due diligence process is the same. And I joke that I had never realized I had so many friends after we made this announcement because there's so many people that I don't actually know, or maybe, I know like third hand or something. People started sending me stuff and finding me on LinkedIn. I'm working on this, so you realize there is a lot going on out there, but that's part of the challenge of it because there are different standards and you want to be just as rigorous in terms of the financial returns, but also is there really going to be impact from this? And is this really consistent with our grant making? And that's one way that when I say roles have shifted, that there's no way that program staff ever came to investment committee meetings before. They would get and listen to the report just like the rest of us, and that was it. And now the investment committee, not so much the committee, but Perella Weinberg Agility, they do meet with our program staff to talk about performance indicators because we've evolved a lot in how we evaluate our grant making. We're pretty flexible in it, but we believe in accountability. And we also talk about performance indicators. So there have been these learning sessions between our investment advisors and our program staff, because the learning does have to go both ways on how do you devise these indicators. That's a really, really hard part of the work.
So that's really interesting because you're describing, of course, a shift in culture now, not just the investment committee's shift in culture, but the practice in terms of how you integrate. And I think this issue of how foundations that do impact investing of various stripes, how we integrate that with our program work, that's an ongoing and tricky area. I want to stay on the topic of foundations for a second, but looking out broadly, how do you feel about the way in which the rest of the foundation world has responded? You said you got a lot of calls and emails from people that had investments to sell you or services, but have other foundations reached out to you? Have you made the difference in the foundation world that you might have liked?
No, of course, we'd always like to do more, or to have others doing more. I think in all honesty, we expected other foundations to come along more quickly. So it got more attention than we were expecting, which was great. But then we thought, oh, there's a lot of interest in it. That means everyone else is going to be rushing to join us. And so one thing we've always done and continue to do is to be as transparent as possible. And that's just sort of the culture of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. But it's also because we want to bring other foundations and all organizations, of course, but foundations in and show them, no, it's possible to do this. This is how you can do it. This is what the process looks like. These are what the returns look like. These are, it's all up on our website, everything that we can put in, that we can make public, because that's a huge part of the movement is sort of the education and also making it possible. Like Perella started a global equity impact fund that we helped seed because there's so many, people who reached out to us who'd like to invest but just don't have the capacity to do it the same way we're doing it, and so trying to make it more accessible. But some foundations have decided to do it differently, and some, even at Williams College, for instance, they did impact before divestment. They've had a lot of student pressure to divest, but there was more board interest in impact, and so you can look at it that way. MacArthur does the PRIs, Rockefeller Foundation does the PRIs, but some of the other Rockefeller organizations are doing the same thing too, and we're able to work with them really closely. But I don't know the insides of other foundations well enough. My sense is that it's the boards that are usually reluctant, not the foundation staff. I think we just had, happy alignment, and maybe that's why we could come out a little more quickly, is because the board and the staff were together on that. But I do think it's good for the field to have people doing this in different ways. And as we were discussing earlier, there's just more coordination now between foundations, and so with the alliance that we're looking at. And so I think this information sharing is a really important part of convincing others to come in. And there's so many groups out there. And I will be nepotistic again and talk about one that my youngest brother, Justin, who's also a Rockefeller Brothers Fund trustee, started, called The Impact, which is an information sharing platform, because he found that he was going to conferences like this and hearing about all these great deals and opportunities, but the language was so different. It was so hard to know what the metric you were using was. It's hard to know what was greenwashing. And so literally just to have data sharing platform. So information for educational purposes, but also so that you could go in and look and see really what are your peers doing and how. So the RBF has become a part of that too in trying to grow this.
And the Impact has been a tremendous organization, and I'm glad that you mentioned that. I wanted to leave a little time to ask questions from the audience, but maybe before, so if you have, I think we'll only have time for like 2 or 3. If you have questions, be thinking of them, and for Valerie or for me, and you can go to the mics that are on the side. I wondered if you would, before we do that, just reflect a little bit. As you look out ahead and you think about what's to come, a lot's happened just in the 4 years since you guys made these incredible changes. Do you have any predictions? Is there anything that's particularly exciting, makes you optimistic? Anything that's making you particularly concerned?
Well, predictions are for continued growth, because it just has to be, and because I think more and more people are seeing the sense of it. I mean, I got actually just an email this morning from Adam Wolfenson, who's on our investment committee, expressing concern, and Encourage Capital, his partner Jason Scott's presenting later today, as is Jamila. But that a concern that he was expressing in another area is that he used this great phrase: it's worthy of over-communicating. The fact that impact has to be part of a philanthropic ecosystem, that it's not pushing out philanthropy. This is not a panacea, that it's not going to solve every problem. And don't worry, the markets will take care of it. Like, whatever happens with this tax cut plan that's going through Congress right now, no, the markets aren't going to take care of all this. These things don't solve themselves. So I would say one prediction, or at least one warning perhaps, is to not overpromise, because disappointing people or making people in philanthropy feel pushed out is not helpful. This just has to be one tool to support the shift to clean energy and more focus on a number of ESG issues. Another prediction, I wouldn't have predicted this, for instance, but another opportunity we had for collaboration between our program staff and our investment advisors was that Perella Weinberg and Tudor Pickering merged. And there was a lot of concern for us that they're an energy firm. And it's actually turned into, and so there was a lot of discussion. Perla Weinberg was very forthcoming that it was happening, and it's turned into a really interesting dialogue with our staff and them about electric vehicles and the shift to a clean energy economy. So that made me optimistic that, it's easy to write off a company and say, okay, that's just what they're going to do. These are the type of investments they make. They're not going to shift their thinking. Of course they will. Everyone can shift their thinking, And so I just think the rapidity that with which this is going to happen is going to be around the education piece of it and the conversation piece of it.
And do you have any advice for the people that are here, whether they're newcomers to impact or longtime seasoned impact investors?
So patience, because it is just much more complicated. And again, for me, without a background in this, my learning curve has been really steep, and I'm very fortunate to have people who, I can learn from to talk about it. In a specific way is hard for me, but talking about it in a moral way is not hard for me. So my advice would be, for us, it's mission alignment. It's also moral. Do not be concerned talking about that or feel uncomfortable talking about that. Values alignment. That's what brings people into the movement. Of course, you have to prove the financial returns. Of course you do. But I think the more you talk about living consistently, the more you're going to bring people into the movement. But again, that it's hard, and especially if you're not willing to make it part of your philanthropic activity or accept lower returns, it's just going to take much longer than you think to do the due diligence and find the right opportunities, but that the impact you can have is so great.
Yeah. So I think it's an early morning and people are not yet feeling like in the mood, except I see Erica, you've got a hand there. You need to come to the mic if you have a question.
So, Valerie, there have been concerns that with impact investing, it's been kind of a rarefied elite space. And so we talk about access to broadband and education and clean power and water, but access to investment opportunities on impact. How do we democratize access to impact investing?
Great question.
That is a great question that I am not qualified to answer, but I think it is going to be in the diversity of funds that you can invest in and having smaller minimums that you can get into. And I think, so this is a way of dodging your question, but you reminded me of something I wanted to say, so I'm going to use that question. I think it's also in how you present, like one of the impact investments that we have is in affordable housing, which we consider consistent with our democratic practice grant making. So I think the more that you show that these investments are helping people who don't have the resources that they need and deserve to live the way that they should be able to. And I think then, again, the more of these funds that there will be more opportunities for people to come in. I also think, again, the diversity of the global divest invest movement is if you're in a faith community, you can speak up and bring other people with you. And I think there's democratization in the inclusivity of the movement too, because then all of a sudden you get powerful in numbers.
I think, just to add, I think...
But you should answer this question.
Well, I would just say, I think that, this issue of how to create the on-ramps and the products is a big one. We're seeing things that have a lot of promise. We're seeing things that have promise, but also challenges. I know there's a young woman that's creating a platform to make it very easy to invest in community development financial institutions and to try to give those that aren't scaled to where they can offer their own note products, to give them a platform that's effective and efficient. And it is interesting to me because she's looking to connect into some of the really promising online platforms that are growing up around investment, particularly those aimed at millennials. And so if this movement of impact investing can kind of plug into and harness some of what's happening in mainstream investment transformation, I think that could also be very powerful. And certainly we have Calvert Foundation, which continues to grow and innovate and has sort of been on the vanguard of that issue. But it's one I think we have to all care about because the line from intention to impact is not direct if we can't provide some kind of route for people to follow. I think we have only just the time for the one more question, so and we'll take that in a second, and then we'll wrap up. Yes.
I'll make this quick.
Can you identify yourself, please?
Mike Benyo, Enduring World. First of all, Debra, thank you for a wonderful job of interviewing. Very nicely done. And Valerie, thank you for sharing your personal journey. I found that very interesting. You said one thing in particular, well, you said a lot of things that were very interesting, but one thing in particular, you spoke about the fact that at one point, the thought process was that this part of the organization is focused on investing, this part of the organization focused on giving, and bringing those two together and transforming it so that it's a more integrated approach. Was that a quick process? Was that something that happened at one board meeting? Or was that something that took several years to take place?
Several years, and is still, I feel like, the main challenge in all of this. I think it is so hard for boards in particular to move beyond that mindset of we just want to make as much money as possible, and that's what I love this, like the student divest and invest part of this, because they're, holding institutions accountable and just looking at things in such a different way. I think for us, there was family receptivity because there were people who'd already tried to do this on their own and who kept thinking. I mean, there's just, if you care about climate change, there are just so many opportunities to despair. And then it makes you creative, though. At one point we gave up on our grant making, trying to change federal policy and focused on states and cities and on China and the Balkans and other places where we felt like we could accomplish more. So I think if you just keep experimenting in lots of different areas, then I think there is that aha moment of this can all be integrated. We could be so much more powerful if this is all integrated. And it is just amazing to think that all these endowments are sitting out there undermining so much of the good work that's being done. You're educating students about climate change, and even some campuses, are going carbon neutral, and then still they have investments because they have an investment committee that won't change. I think you just have to keep making it explicit.
Thank you.
So I just really want to thank you. It's been a real pleasure and really fascinating to kind of pull back the curtain and hear a lot more about the journey that RBF has followed. I want to also thank you especially for commenting on Adam's admonition for us to all remember that there is a big ecosystem, and the way in which you also just really call out the different kinds of impact investment, the different models, the different approaches, and that it all adds up at the end of the day to what we need. So thank you so much, Valerie.
Thank you so much.